Well, thank you very much for coming today. I think all of us on the platform are not just amazed, but extremely gratified to see so many people at a discussion of teaching English to speakers of other languages, which I think all of us think is a very important subject. I'm going to be chairing this. My name's Mary Dejevsky. I write a column for The Independent, and I also write for The Guardian. I have two qualifications for doing this. One oblique, which is that I'm a former foreign correspondent, so I've lived and worked abroad and I speak other languages. The other qualification, which goes back a few years, but when I was finishing my research as a postgraduate, I eked out my grant by teaching English to foreign students. All sorts of foreign students with all sorts of first languages. So I've seen a bit of it, at least, from the other side of the fence. I will introduce the speakers just before each of them speaks. And the first speaker today will be James Berry MP, who is an MP for South West London constituency, which, as you will know, probably better than I do, has been full of marginal constituencies with the Lib Dems, and he is the person who, depending on your point of view, was the dragon slayer or the dreadful villain who conquered Ed Davey. So, Janet, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to see so many people here. I understand that there was a potential appearance from Boris Johnson. I'm not Boris Johnson, I'm afraid. But this is my first conference event actually speaking as a Member of Parliament. And when you're elected as an MP, you're told that that's the last time you will ever be able to answer people's questions straightforwardly and directly. But I want to go against the grain and answer the question in this debate: is learning English the secret to one nation directly, with a word no. Because I would say it is critical to one nation to learn English, but I would not say it's much of a secret. In fact, I think it's self-evident that having a community without the tools for communication with the rest of society is a very sad and regressive state of affairs. And it was Wittgenstein who famously said that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. For the 2% of people in this country who cannot speak English or do so very poorly, their options are terribly limited. People who can't speak English aren't just out of touch with what's going on around them, but they are effectively completely cut off from society and are particularly vulnerable as a result. And in my constituency of Kingston and Surbiton, we have the largest Korean population in Europe. Now, that's a large population that's able to be self-sufficient, and there is an issue there with people not speaking English, but there's such a critical mass, they're able to exist and be a very successful community. But where you have smaller ethnic groups and clusters that can't speak English, that is a very dangerous state of affairs, because it makes them vulnerable, and vulnerable, I think, to two things in particular due to lack of English language capacity. First, to unemployment, and the figures bear this out. Over 50% of those who don't have a good grasp of English are unemployed, and that's 66% when we look at unemployed females who can't speak English well. And that compares with 72% of the population at large being in work. I think they're pretty stark figures. And secondly, the second vulnerability that strikes me is the potentially dangerous lack of access to the basic provisions and protections in our society, in particular the health sector and the justice sector. And that's particularly perceptible in cases involving domestic violence or human trafficking. I know from my work on the Home Affairs Select Committee that it's difficult enough getting people who've been victims of domestic violence and human trafficking to come forward and give evidence at all. It's even more difficult when they don't have the language tools to be able to report these matters to the police and to the authorities. As someone who's passionate about early years education, I was interested to look into the challenges that migrant children face. And according to the figures, 1.12 million children now speak English as a second language. In boroughs in London, such as Westminster, where I'm a primary school governor, there are huge numbers of children in the primary schools who speak English as a second or even a third language. However, interestingly, research shows that children who go into reception without English as their first language actually perform very well. They tend to leave school bilingual, tend to perform very well at school. And in fact, the risk group amongst primary school children, the bottom 25%, are white working class monolingual pupils, and they tend to perform the worst. This is beginning to be talked about, this group, but perhaps not enough, and maybe putting effort into assisting that group, who should be speaking English well, is one of the secrets of One Nation. But coming back to the topic of today's agenda, I think in London we see the lack of English speaking at its worst. Apparently 1 in 10 people in London who live in London are not able to speak the native language here, and that's an incredibly high number. It clearly has an impact on unemployment, it has an impact on crime, it has an impact on community cohesion, and it's an issue we need to resolve. One Nation conservatism is an idea that stemmed from the great Disraeli, one of my personal heroes. And although One Nation is in fact wrongly attributed to him as a direct quotation, he spoke of 2 nations. He was the grandson of Italian Jewish immigrants himself, and the philosophy of One Nation is all about challenging divisions between rich and poor. It's also at its root about bringing all communities in this country that have something to offer together. And it's that cohesion that's brought great results, from Minnie to Marks and Spencer's, a multitude of migrants over the last number of tens and hundreds of years have made Britain the great place it is to live today. And I know this personally because my wife is originally from East Africa. So whilst austerity has meant that adult services providers have had to tighten their belts, the government does continue to cover the cost of English language training for those who've been in the UK for at least 3 years and are in receipt of job seekers allowance to improve their English so that they can find work. And while I guess that funding of this nature will be raised in this session by other speakers, I think in this economic climate you have to look at 2 categories of migrants. There's economic migrants and people who are asylum seekers and refugees. And whilst there's clearly more work to be done in the second category, in the first category, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect people who come here to work to be able to speak English to the requisite standard to actually contribute to and participate in society, rather than the taxpayer having to bear the burden of that training. But I think Demos's report on speaking terms, which I'm sure you've all read because you're here, or you all will after you've left, has a number of really interesting ideas. Firstly, encouraging large employers who employ a significant number of people from abroad to support those employees in learning English. I think there are long-term gains for companies in doing so, and it's absolutely what One Nation thinking is all about, sharing our obligations. I also think that it's right that BIS should possibly examine the option of extending FE advanced learning loans to English as a second language learning. I think English as a second language courses would be a great way, when funding is limited through loans, to ensure that as many people here speak English well as possible. It's very much in our interest to create One Nation. That's what this government is all about. And that's about getting people into jobs, into education, and fully integrated in our community. And that's why learning English is at the very heart of all we're doing. So I look forward to having outlined the problems, hearing all about the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Ros Lucas, who is the Executive Director of the Migrants Research Council, and she will obviously come at this from a very different perspective from James's, but she has enormous experience in this area of both researching and dispensing advice. So I think over to you, Ros.
Okay, just a small correction, it's the Migrants Resource Centre.
I'm sorry.
So we're not a research body, although we do research, and our organisation works with migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, and now the aim of the organisation is to remove the barriers that they face in participating in society in the UK. So how does ESOL fit into the One Nation vision? Well, as it's been said here, it's critical to it. Without it, sections of the migrant and refugee community will not be or become socially integrated. What we find from our users, that they are unable to get jobs, others are stuck in low-paid jobs and sometimes exploited, irrespective of their qualifications and skills that they might arrive in the country with, And it often means that they end up working in restaurants, quite often in the same community, so they don't get any exposure to other people with other languages in the country, often in cleaning jobs, and they're not mixing. They're unable to play an active role in their children's education, and there's quite a lot of research about migrant children and exclusion. They're also unable to express their health needs. They also don't understand about the health service, so we find that we have to give advice about, depending on their status, about where they can go, and then they can't explain what's actually wrong with them. They're unable to understand their rights and responsibilities, and finally unable to contribute fully to life in the UK. And everybody that comes to our centre comes, I suppose, because they want to contribute. They come and they say, we want a job and we want to learn English. So for all of those people, they want to contribute. For the individual that is unable to get over those barriers, this often leads to social isolation, low self-esteem, and sometimes mental health problems. For society, it may lead to a loss of skills, the lack of social cohesion, and a loss of benefit that social diversity can bring. One of the questions posed was, how can or should government support more ESOL learning? And I'd like to have a quick look at the current arrangements as they impact on our organisation and the users that we have at our organisation. We have classes that are delivered by an adult education service, but as James already said, there are restrictions on who they can accept on a course. They can accept EU migrants, and they can accept people that have been 3 years resident in the UK and asylum seekers after 6 months. However, there's a problem with the level of the courses as well. We have 2-stage courses below the beginner's level that the adult education service will bring, because for many it's too advanced for many of our users, some of whom are illiterate or have no English at all and are totally unused to any sort of formal education. There are often barriers to them going, those that do qualify for adult education, there are often barriers to them accessing it because they go to the local reception or they go to the local college and they can't make themselves understood, or there's a lack of flexibility in the type of course that's being run. And there is also a lack of trust of probably the larger establishments, and they would prefer to come to a community organisation. So I've touched a bit about what we do, but I'd just like to talk about that a bit more. There is a programme called English My Way, which is being funded, and that we have about 4 cohorts per year, and a combination of classes at starter level and IT, and that has IT involved in that as well. But we have a problem that for people that are pre-entry, that's with no English. From our charitable resources, and none of this is funded, and I'll talk a bit about how we do it at the moment, we have these lower level classes and we have no restrictions on eligibility. We have a culturally appropriate multilingual staff team, and we're flexible. And then we also provide linked skills training, because for the person who is not happy with formal learning, then coming in by some other route, perhaps by some creative route, that might be doing knitting, it might be doing embroidery, then actually having classes where they can talk and converse with other people, that's one way of them starting to learn English. And what I was saying to somebody earlier was that I remember working in the language and literacy unit for the Inner London Education Authority in 1984, and the British Council was funding ESL classes, linked skills classes then, and it was seen to be a really good idea. So we haven't really moved very much, have we? And just to give you a small case study, we've got we had a lady who was very isolated, only ever left home to take her children to school or to go to the shops, actually knew nothing beyond about a half a mile radius. She was recruited for one of our projects, which was called Journey to Integration. During that time, they asked her what her skills were, and she actually said that she could knit. She actually, through that project, is now volunteering for Knit for Peace, and it's transformed her life. So it's very important to engage with people at the level that they can get engaged at. The other thing that we do through most of our classes is we focus on what might be good for them. So ESOL and literacy, ESOL and health, ESOL for work, ESOL and orientation. And throughout all the classes there is a learning about UK systems and UK procedures and democracy and all of those things that help people to understand their rights and responsibilities in the country that they're living in. Another question was about what are the roles and responsibilities of other stakeholders, including employers. I suppose the people that we see, employers do have a role, but most of the time they'll be coming in for jobs, and maybe there is an economic reason why those employers should be helping to ensure that their staff access ESOL. The small employers like the Indian restaurants, I'm not just picking on them, but the Chinese restaurant, those that employ their own staff, they are not they are not going to be those kind of employers that are sending their staff for ESOL classes. Funders, the Skills Funding Agency, I think, needs to be adequately funded to ensure a more flexible offering is available. What we've seen over the years is that the criteria for accessing English language classes has actually got harder and harder. And in fact, it needs to be the other way if we really believe that ESOL is critical to a One Nation vision. Local authorities were funders of many community organisations' ESOL provision. As austerity cuts have resulted in cuts to that provision, we now find, so at Migrants Resource Centre, we have no funding for our ESOL provision, and yet we run a whole range of the timetable of courses because we have the support of volunteer tutors who are retired or come and run classes in the evening, and we have a very, very flexible approach. It's never enough, of course. So we believe that government and local authorities should prioritise funding for ESOL. Without it, groups in society will be socially isolated and struggle to be part of society in the UK. And I think the One Nation vision will be unachievable.
Thank you, Rose. The third member of our panel is David Goodhart, who is formerly on the FT and was the founder and first editor of Prospect magazine. And he's made a bit of a name for himself with his views on migration and multiculturalism, and produced a book, The British Dream, a couple of years ago. David.
Thank you very much. I was also recently the director of Demos, which I think is probably the main reason I'm sitting here, and remain the director of the Demos Integration Hub. And indeed, it was when I was director of Demos that we commissioned this pamphlet as part of our mapping integration project. But as Mary points out, I'm not. This is not my specialist subject, as it were, but I have been interested in the broader issues that it touches upon for a long time. This really is motherhood and apple pie for all political parties, and has been now for quite a long time. That everybody, all newcomers to the country, and indeed people who've been here for some time, should speak the language for all the obvious reasons. We know how much not speaking the language holds back both people's individual opportunities and a more integrated society. If I can just throw in another stat, 17% of the employment gap between British-born and non-British-born is thought to be down to language issues, and about 25% of the wage gap too. So, as I say, all the political parties for some time have been interested in this area, partly because integration more generally in a liberal society is a very difficult thing to promote. You can't tell people where to send their children to school or where they should live. One can nudge perhaps here and there, but and in many parts of the country, partly I think because of the speed and scale of recent integration, there are issues of integration and segregation. But the one thing that everybody has been able to agree on is that everybody should speak English. But beware of a national consensus, because since this consensus has developed in the last 5 or 10 years, the number of people doing ESOL courses has substantially fallen, and the subsidy for ESOL courses has fallen even further. I think, Nick will correct me if I'm wrong, I think in the mid-2000s, the period of kind of maximum liberalism in this area, there were at one point almost 500,000 people doing ESOL courses, and the annual subsidy was about £300 million. The annual subsidy is now about half that, and the number of people doing courses is now only about 150,000. Now, I don't think what was happening in the mid-2000s was probably sustainable, and there were all sorts of stories about how people were coming from. I mean, this was after the opening to the poorer Central and Eastern European countries after 2004. I think a lot of people, or some people anyway, were coming from Poland, signing up for ESOL courses, polishing up their English, and then going home again. And clearly that couldn't last. And also, I think there is a genuine issue about whether British taxpayers should be funding at that sort of scale the language lessons of people who are going to become competitors to them in the labour market. Now, obviously, there are huge, important, bigger factors to do with integration and one nation, but whether all of the cost should fall on taxpayers is obviously an issue, and clearly that is no longer the case. And how we fund, what the kind of fair balance of funding here is between the individual, who, as with higher education, we assume that students should pay for at least a chunk of their higher education costs because they're going to benefit from it. Exactly the same principle apply with learning English, and so there should be some sort of balance between the individual recipient of the classes, the state, because there is a wider public interest in this, and employers. And I think possibly higher education might be recruited here in some sort of funding capacity. Higher education has benefited enormously from very significant inflows of immigrants in the last few years, the last 10 or 15 years, many of whom do end up one way or another staying in the country, and there might well be ways in which we could think about how the higher education sector could chip in here a bit. But as I was just saying, there is a real parallel, I think, here between the ways in which we have started to fund higher education, and we should think about using loans more. It's one of the recommendations in the Demos report. I think the other thing that is perhaps talked about, I mean, there are the technical issues that Nick will talk about. It isn't just to do with funding. We tend to talk rather too much about a government subsidy, I think. When we talk about ESOL, it tends to be the sort of default theme. There are have been all sorts of other issues with our rather messy, unstructured system. It tends to not be very good for people, both at the very bottom level of language ability and for people who are at the top level. We also don't measure progress properly and fund it in appropriate ways. As I say, Nick, I'm sure we'll talk about some of those things. But I think there is a broader issue of how we can bring mentoring into this. How can we? I mean, it's one thing just to learn English in a classroom for a few hours every week, but actually the opportunity to then converse with people in English, converse with native English speakers, and this is something where the voluntary sector, mentors, can play a very important role, I think. And the other area, of course, is schools. I mean, virtually every second generation person from an originally immigrant family speaks English fluently, and schools pay for that. We spend about £300 million a year teaching kids to speak English in school, in primary and to a lesser extent secondary schools. Whether parents could be involved in that process is something that's also worth thinking about. There is also the wider issue, not just teaching English to newcomers to the country, but what happens subsequently. About a third of ethnic minority households in Britain speak at home a language other than English. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Multilingualism is a good thing. It helps in all sorts of cognitive processes. But I think people. It's a much bigger issue in America, where there's a much bigger bloc, the Hispanics population, who are persistently speak Spanish in second, third, fourth generations. That doesn't seem to be happening here, although so you've seen, Indian households, according to the last census, Indian households now have just gone over 50% speak English at home, which is up from only a third speaking English at home in 1997. Pakistani households, 45% speak English. Bangladeshis are much lower at 38%. As I say, I think there's a certain ambivalence about this. On the one hand, you might say so long as those households, or the people living in them, are absolutely confident in English, then there's a sort of healthy sort of bilingualism, biculturalism, one might say. But I suspect that isn't always the case, that it is, in some cases, a symptom of continuing to live very separately, and something that we should think about. And one of the issues that's always brought up in this argument is the whole question of translation, and whether we should. And people make these great announcements every now and then. Who's the minister from Bradford? Pickles. Eric Pickles made an announcement a few years ago that we were going to stop translating, and all the money that used to go on translation, 150 million a year, was going to go into teaching people English. I bet my bottom dollar that hasn't happened. I bet we are still translating, perhaps not on the scale that we used to, but I do think that we should keep an eye on these things. We should monitor that, and I think it would be good if we did shift the money from translating to. And Newham, Robin Wales in Newham has talked about this too. And London is a particular issue. More than 20% of households in London are not English speakers, and I think that does raise important issues. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, our final speaker is Dr. Nick Saville, who has a most glorious title, and I don't know how you translate it into any other language, was Director, Research and Thought Leadership at Cambridge English Language Assessment. And I'm sure that, as it were, the language teaching professional on the panel, he will present that angle, but he'll also probably explain what his title means.
I won't just start with that. I'll go straight into the speech I prepared. So a slightly different perspective. I work for Cambridge English Language Assessment, which is part of Cambridge Assessment, which itself is a department of the University of Cambridge, which dates back about 150 years. Cambridge English is one of 3 examination boards that make up Cambridge Assessment, and you've got more information if you're interested in this. But just to say that together with OCR, which is one of the exam boards you're probably familiar with for school exams, and Cambridge international exams, we together assess about, these days, 8 million people around the world, about 170 countries. All 3 of the exam boards have expertise in delivering English language programs in different forms in this country and overseas. Of course, there are the GCSEs and A-levels that you're all familiar with, but we also do vocational learning and qualifications, bilingual curricula, and crucially, sector-specific English tests for medical, business, and academic. And this is the area in particular I work in. For example, we created IELTS in partnership with the British Council, which is the preeminent test for academic purposes, taken, I should think, by about 3 million people this year around the world. So it's what provides access for universities. We also advise ministries and governments around the world on their national education system reform programs where there's a language policy, including programs to improve English language competence and skills. And in most countries, English is a basic skill now for people learning in primary school. But what this tells me is that also the UK's problems are not unique. So English is an issue wherever you go. So turning to the title, the problem, is learning English the secret to one nation? Well, I think we would probably agree the answer is yes. But that does, of course, need unpacking along the lines we've heard tonight. And we seem to agree, I think, that sharing a common language is a vital step towards social cohesion amongst our communities and in building a shared culture. Bringing communities together, I think, was the Disraeli idea of one nation. I think that's really important. Yet, in the UK, especially in England, we are failing to teach English adequately to newcomers and long-term residents who live and work amongst us. So I highly recommend this little book to anyone in government on speaking terms, which actually was sponsored by us in Cambridge, and I worked with some of the Demos people. And if you've got little time, I recommend the 11 recommendations at the beginning to have a look through. I believe it's an excellent report and provides a long overdue analysis of a system that has failed under successive governments. It seems that we've neither helped our migrant population to integrate effectively, nor, as we've heard, enable them to realise their economic potential to the detriment of all of us. Importantly, I think it shows that the problem stems not just from a lack of funding, but a fundamental misconception about the English language and how languages are learnt, leading to poor use of the money available. Above all, it highlights a failure to have a coherent, overarching strategy in place with the correct drivers, policy goals, benchmarking, and practical options for the learners themselves. And as a result, large amounts of public money have been spent without solving the problems, whether economic or social. And we've heard the scale of the problem. Rather shockingly, this report estimates that around 850,000 migrants consider their English non-existent or too poor, which from an integration perspective is highly troublesome and unsatisfactory. And we know, and we've heard already, that without the necessary communication skills in English, members of our society get locked into low-paid employment with all the social and economic ills that that can cause. And while we're at it, let's remember that this also applies to our native-born adults. Nearly a quarter are also without the prerequisite communications and skills to allow them to escape from low wages and low expectations. What the UK describes as below grade D at GCSE. And this is in the country that created the language that is now the world's lingua franca. So, a problem. So what about the way forward? Here's my pitch. What we need is a coherent English language strategy, bringing together, one nation idea, multiple departments that otherwise operate their own strategies based on different drivers. So how should that strategy be developed? 3 points I'd like to make. Firstly, policymakers need to consider the varying needs of the groups of those without English, to tease apart what kind of support is needed in different cases. And this will enable, I think, clearer eligibility criteria to be established for various kinds of language learning support to ensure that where government funding is made available, it reaches the intended target. Secondly, how can we understand better how English is actually used in practice, for what purposes and in what contexts? Part of the problem over the last decade or so has been an insistence on, you might call it a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching English, and a focus on the proficiency level that has to be reached. And this is clearly an oversimplification and hasn't worked, whichever government has been in power. Just saying, for example, this is the level that you have to get to access something or do something, is not an effective way of approaching the task. Moreover, we should also remember that not everyone finds it easy to learn other languages. So, hands up in the audience if you've struggled in the past. I see quite a few hands coming up. So this is important. Okay, putting a language learning strategy in place, therefore, is not just about English skills needed in education or the workplace. It must go further than this and must consider learners who are spouses, retired people, house workers, home workers, those who, like some of us, who hated school, those who have a myriad of other reasons for learning the language. We need to tap into their motivations. Many people may never, as we heard, enter the workplace and may live predominantly with their families or in a monolingual community, but nevertheless still need to interact with speakers of English, even in a limited way, for health or justice or whatever. Thirdly, it's important to have an appropriate mechanism in place for assessing learners' current level and then measuring their progression over time. Learning takes place over time, and we need well-focused learning programs to support that. Our research in Cambridge has shown that it's important to have an explicit framework, or what might be called a learning ladder, in place. In other words, we must set realistic goals, which allows progression to be measured reliably and tracked over time, as it were, up the ladder. So taking our learners up the ladder. This is where recognised qualifications and language frameworks come in. The common European framework of reference, called the CFR, which is referred to in this book, for example, can play a really important role in this respect. It's a framework which is now used globally and is proven successful in providing learning and outcome objectives. It's already used in the UK, by the way, by the Home Office to set language ability levels for visa purposes, for example, for study, and is by far the most widely used framework used by governments and education institutions around the world. And an important point, there are numerous learning materials and examinations available that are linked to this international standard, many of them free, and could be curated online and used for learning purposes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the proposition before us is a simple one. Our migrant population is not going anywhere, more are coming, and we have to remember that the Brits also struggle with English. We already spend £100 million or whatever of taxpayers' money supporting learning programs with not enough benefit with for the migrants, the newcomers, or for the country as a whole. As a result, as we've heard, we condemn many of our fellow citizens, long-term residents, Brits, to a life of unfulfilled economic potential and disengagement from the one-nation society. Why continue to put our heads in the sand, throw good money after bad? Let's use the UK's excellent courses, English language experts, and work constructively with the thousands of specialist teachers, community support workers, and so on, to create a coherent cross-government strategy. One that will make a real difference, one that can be implemented effectively, and with positive and lasting impact on our society. Thank you very much.